Hello HTTP, Alberto Vargas here. Just wanted to drop in and say hello. I will be watching from Los Angeles, California, así que I'm super excited for this summit. Alejandro, congratulations on all your hard work. I'm looking forward to it, así que saludos. Stay safe, everybody.
Today, having broadband access is linked to our health, our well-being, and our economic security. This is especially true for the Latino community, Black and Indigenous communities of color, as well as rural and low-income households or families who are experiencing economic hardship because of the coronavirus and who might face compounding obstacles to establishing and sustaining a reliable at-home broadband connection. Having access to the internet allows students to continue to learn. It gives parents the options to pursue remote employment options, and it allows us to host this virtual summit from the comfort of my home. Central to the solution of bridging the digital divide is our ability to extend broadband infrastructure to every home at an affordable price. At the heart of our government strategy to ensure that every American is connected is the Federal Communications Commission, an independent government agency with congressional oversight who is responsible for enforcing America's communication laws and regulations. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Ajit Pai, current chairman of the FCC, to what I am lovingly calling our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything as a part of our inaugural Digital Inclusion Summit. Ajit is the son of immigrants from India who grew up in the state of Kansas and was first appointed to the FCC by President Obama, where he was confirmed unanimously by the US Senate. He was later designated as chairman by President Trump in 2017, where he currently leads the FCC's efforts to regulate the country's communications infrastructure, including TV, phone, and internet service. Ajit, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello, everybody. My gratitude to Alejandro and everybody at the Hispanic Telecom and Technology Partnership for inviting me to be a part of the hopefully first of many, Digital Inclusion Summit. I look forward to today's question and answer session, but before I get to that, I've been asked to deliver some brief remarks. And so I'd like to start off, if I might, with a story. In November of 2017, I visited Puerto Rico to survey the damage from hurricanes Irma and Maria. Almost 2 months had passed since those historic storms, the devastation was still unlike anything I had ever seen. There were remnants from mudslides, there were downed power lines, there was debris everywhere on and off the roads. And I specifically remember seeing a huge concrete pole that was used for stringing power lines that had been bent over by about 120 degrees. Some 47% of the cell sites on the island were still out of service, which, believe it or not, was actually tremendous progress from just a few weeks before, when 95% of the cell sites were out immediately after the storm. Now, the FCC acted quickly to help with the initial restoration efforts. Under my direction, we provided an immediate infusion of about $66 million from our Universal Service Fund to help carriers in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The FCC later set up what we call the Uniendo a Puerto Rico Fund and the Connect USVI Fund, which in their first stages alone provided an extra $130 million in funding for network restoration in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Now, while I'm gratified that the FCC moved very quickly to provide immediate relief, I'm also especially proud that we didn't stop there. In fact, in March of 2018, I made a return visit to Puerto Rico, and it was clear that the island faced many connectivity challenges that preceded these historic storms. And so appropriately and accordingly, the FCC approved up to $950 million, almost $1 billion, in additional investments through a second stage of funding for both the Uniendo a Puerto Rico Fund and the Connect USVI Fund. Now, the goal of this funding goes far beyond simply recovering from the devastating storms of Irma and Maria. It's more about connecting everyone in Puerto Rico with what I call digital opportunity and ensuring that the hardened networks will be there to withstand the next storm, which we know will come someday. It's about bringing broadband connectivity to people and places in Puerto Rico and indeed other territories that have never had broadband access. So this is not a plan to return Puerto Rico to the way things were, but a bold plan to move Puerto Rico fully forward into a digital future. Now, I tell you this story at some length, for which I apologize, but because I think it applies directly to our current crisis. If there is one positive to come out of the pandemic, it's that it has ended once and for all any debate about the need for universal access to high-speed broadband. If you don't have broadband, you can't work from home. Your children can't attend online classes. You can't see a healthcare provider immediately and remotely. You can't FaceTime with your parents or other loved ones who are staying safe at home. I could go on, but I think Alejandro framed it very well, the importance of digital connectivity in the unfortunate times in which we are living. At the onset of the pandemic, the FCC decided that our top priority was to make sure that as many Americans as possible would have internet access and that no American consumer would lose service because of disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why, to meet this priority, among other things, in mid-March, I called upon America's broadband and telephone providers to sign on to what I call the Keep Americans Connected pledge. This pledge had three basic parts. Number one, that no consumer would have broadband or telephone service cut off as a result of disruptions caused by the pandemic. Number two, that any late fees or similar charges would be waived because of those similar disruptions. And number three, that Wi-Fi hotspots would be opened up for any consumer who might need them. Ultimately, almost 800 companies, representing the vast majority of American consumers, signed the pledge, and that pledge was extended until June. Many companies even went above and beyond the pledge to offer things like free service for some constituencies, to work with schools and hospitals and others, and to provide additional things that went beyond the pledge. Now, again, COVID-19 has raised the awareness among the American people about the importance of closing the digital divide. And I will say the Keep Americans Connected pledge proved to be a very effective solution to the immediate connectivity challenges highlighted by the pandemic. But across the country, just as in Puerto Rico, as I discussed, we had a connectivity gap before the pandemic that will still be a challenge in the years ahead. COVID-19, for instance, is not the reason why 23% of Hispanic households with school-age children lack access to home broadband. That is the digital divide with which too many Americans have been living. That is the priority that we have made our top priority over the last several years. And that's why the FCC has pursued and will continue to pursue an aggressive strategy to connect all Americans, including Hispanic households. Now, in the United States, of course, we primarily rely on roughly about $80 billion in private investment every year to upgrade and expand our wired and wireless networks. And that's why bridging the digital divide requires reducing the cost of broadband build-out, which in turn requires reducing the regulatory barriers to such build-out. Now, across the board, the FCC has been working hard to modernize its regulations and to clear out any unnecessary roadblocks to broadband investment. The details of this can sound definitely boring, I will concede. Easing access to utility poles, making it easier for companies to transition from copper to fiber, moving from rules developed in the 1930s to regulate Ma Bell to a more forward-thinking market-based framework and other policies like that. But however arcane the details, the results really pop. They're certainly anything but arcane. Millions more Americans have access to the internet today than they did in 2016. In 2018, we set a record for fiber deployment in the United States, a record that was broken in 2019. The number of small cells in the United States and cell sites generally has skyrocketed. Average download speeds for fixed broadband have doubled since the end of 2017. The number of Americans enjoying more than two options for standard fixed terrestrial broadband service has increased by 52%. And a new independent study came out just this month showing that compared to 2015, today's average consumer is paying 28% less for broadband in real terms while enjoying faster speeds. So we've made a lot of progress, but that's not a reason to say, job done, let's move on, because we still have work to do. Here's the bottom line. On my first day as FCC chairman, I said that my number one priority, our agency's number one priority, would be closing the digital divide and making sure that every consumer would have the benefits of the digital revolution, regardless of what he or she happened to look like or where they happen to live. We've made a lot of progress towards that goal over the last 3.5 years, but we're not going to be letting up anytime soon. And so I look forward to working with the Hispanic Telecom and Technology Partnership and other dedicated advocates like you to make sure that we deliver digital opportunity to every single American. Thanks so much again for having me, and I look forward to a very successful Digital Inclusion Summit. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ajit. I mean, I think that you really bring up a lot of really interesting points, and I think that we really were tested. COVID-19 really tested the capacity of our networks. It tested, I think, the spirit of collaboration between internet service providers and local government. And I think, like as you highlighted, since your first day as chairman of FCC, you really have been clear that your top priority is closing the digital divide. So from your perspective, and having traveled extensively through rural towns across America to understand, I think, their unique kind of service needs, what do you think it's going to take to achieve universal broadband access in both rural communities and underserved urban areas?
That's the key question. I think there are basically two tools in the toolbox that we need to wield, and in some cases we might need additional authority to wield. Number one is continuing to reduce the regulatory burden to create a better business case for broadband deployment. Obviously, as I mentioned, we rely heavily on the private sector to build these networks, and it's an iron law of economics that if the return on the investment isn't there, there's not going to be a business case for building these networks. So we want to make sure that we streamline the process to, of course, protect the public interest and consumer protection in particular, but also create a business case for deployment. And that's where the things like pole attachment reform and encouraging the migration from copper to fiber is so important. But secondly, and critically, I think that federal funding, and funding at all levels of government, honestly, is very necessary. In my first major speech as FCC chairman in March of 2017, I said that as Congress was considering an infrastructure plan, that I thought that substantial funding for broadband was important. And I continue to believe that today. We are going to be starting in a few weeks a $20 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund to get unserved parts of the country connected. We're also going to be starting a 5G fund, which will be $9 billion to connect parts of the country which are unlikely to see 5G wireless connectivity. Even with that, we anticipate there are going to be some parts of the country that will still remain unserved. And so that's why we've been working with Congress and encouraging them to think broadly about how we are going to get everybody connected. Every American needs this platform to be able to do things like telework and telehealth. So we need to work with Congress to make sure in a bipartisan way that we're able to do that.
And as you've kind of illustrated in your remarks so far, your regulatory philosophy really has been guided by a few simple principles with the goal of establishing a regulatory framework that will result in more investment, faster economic growth, and lower prices. So I wonder, having this being kind of like our Digital Inclusion Summit, could you share with us, what's the role that equity and inclusion play in shaping your policies and your regulatory philosophy?
It's absolutely vital. And that's why I don't say broadband access so much as I say digital opportunity, because to me, that's really what this is about. It's informed, as you hinted at in your first question, by some of my travels. I mean, these are the stories that stick with me when I'm in my office, or now, of course, during the pandemic, working here at home. It's the story about visiting the Jemez Pueblo and seeing how low-income tribal members for the first time have access to fiber at the local tribal school, and kids can do their homework. It's the visit to the San Fernando Institute for Applied Media, where I met 3 different groups of parents, each of whom had Spanish as a primary language, who told me, which I can understand in my own broken Spanish, how important it was for them to for their kids to have internet access, and for them to have internet access for things like applying for jobs. It's the very last visit I did to Wyoming, rural Wyoming, before the pandemic ended the FCC's travel, to the Wind River Reservation, where I met with the Northern Arapaho tribal leaders who told me how getting Connect America funding from the FCC in 2018 had now allowed the tribal school and the tribal health clinic to get connected with fiber, which was a game changer. I mean, these are the people who you rarely will see on the front pages of the newspaper or on the cable news networks, but they are the Americans who need to be the foot soldiers of the digital revolution. We need to be able to connect them. That's all about inclusion. And I also would like to say that, this is important to me personally in terms of my management at the agency. If you look at some of the things we've done on diversity, reconstituting the Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment, which before I took office had just fallen into disrepair, starting an internship program to make sure that the next generation of talent, especially from HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions, can have a stipend so that they can actually work at the FCC, and to make sure that our own workforce reflects the richness of the American social fabric. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are important to let the American people know that we're leading not just in word through the orders and reforms we push out, but also in deed, how it is that we represent the face of the FCC to the American people.
That's really wonderful. I'd heard that you guys have started kind of like an internship program, but it's great to hear that it's paid and that has the intentionality of including historically kind of like underserved communities. So that's awesome.
And I have to give credit for that to Commissioner Starks as well. Commissioner Starks came up with the idea. We're working together on it. Just another good example of how diversity and inclusion is not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. It's just an American issue to me.
Absolutely. And so our goal here with the Digital Inclusion Summit really is to convene diverse stakeholders to establish real solutions through an intersectional lens that considers how factors such as race, zip code, cultural background, and ability impact broadband adoption rates and either limits or expands the circle of digital opportunity. As a representative voice yourself and an influential voice, how are you working with Congress and industry leaders during this time of great change to center the lives and experiences of communities of color to ensure that we're creating the future of everything that is inclusive, equitable, and safe? And from your perspective, what does that future look like?
That's a really good question. So to me, at least, some of it involves our basic programmatic work that I just described. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the 5G Fund, all of these types of programs and regulatory reforms have an eye, as I said, to making sure that every American has access who wants it. But even more than that, I think it's important for us to be able to push some reforms through Congress. So for example, in 2016, I proposed what I call digital gigabit opportunity zones. And the idea here is that you would pick a geographic area. It could be a very rural county, or it could be an urban city block, which had 75% or less of the national median income. And Congress would provide essentially tax breaks to allow companies to build infrastructure in those areas, to make it easier for those areas to get broadband access. There's bipartisan legislation that was introduced in the Senate, for example, by Senator Capito from West Virginia and Senator Coons from Delaware, a Republican and a Democrat, following up on this. It's called the Gigabit Opportunity Act. And so that's the kind of thing I've been trying to push for a while, to make sure that whether you're in an urban area or in a rural area, where the Congress is stepping up to the plate to make that business case easier. So, working with advocates and with elected officials, I hope that we can finally push this big boulder, so to speak, up to the top of the mountain.
Absolutely. And I think what this kind of global health crisis has kind of taught us is that, bridging the digital divide and achieving universal access really will take a collaborative and integrated approach with both, agencies like the FCC, with Congress, with local communities. And so I think that is paramount and important to really kind of establishing kind of like a durable solution that connects every American. So I feel like for the past 3 years, your policies have also not been without a little bit of criticism, right? So specifically on
yes.
So specifically on the issue of net neutrality, right?
Yeah.
What do you think that people misunderstand about your regulatory approach on this issue and its impact on not just its ability to incentivize deployment, but also how we as consumers experience the internet, specifically for diverse communities who may already face compounding barriers to access and adoption?
That's a fantastic question. It's very interesting. I go on Twitter pretty much daily now at this point and do a search for some of these tweets. And it's amazing how many people say, wow, remember how we thought the internet was going to end in 2017? Whatever happened with that? And it was such a big sound and fury, and nothing ever came of it. And that's exactly the point. A lot of these predictions that were made back in December of 2017, you're going to have to pay $5 per tweet. You'll get the internet one word at a time, or this is the end of the internet as we know it, as one news outlet put it. All of those have just fallen by the wayside. In fact, as I mentioned during my remarks, average fixed broadband speeds in the U.S. have doubled since we made that decision. Millions more Americans have access to the internet. We've set records in terms of fiber deployment and wireless infrastructure investment. So the internet overall is very strong, and it's getting better. And what's very interesting is the comparison with Europe. Europe still has the utility-style net neutrality regulation that many of those advocates here in the U.S. seem to support. And where is Europe's internet right now? Well, I actually just read this afternoon an article on Bloomberg, and I'm actually reading the headline, October 9th, Pandemic Exposes Europe's Creaking Internet for All to See. And they talk about the fact that they've had subpar infrastructure investment for years, and that's part of the reason why now the European Commission, the group that supervises all member states of the European Union, had to go proactively to YouTube and Netflix and other streaming companies during the pandemic and ask them to proactively throttle content to consumers from HD down to SD. So now consumers have the worst of all worlds. They have these utility-style regulations, and they have poor internet service as a result. So notwithstanding all of the heat that we've taken, that I personally have taken over the last 3 years, I know we made the right decision, the courageous decision, the decision to restore the bipartisan market-based framework that had governed the internet so well from 1996 until 2015. And the proof is now in the pudding. With the pandemic, even with the influx of internet traffic we've seen over the last 7 months, the networks have held up very well, and speeds are actually up over the last 7 months of the pandemic, which is not something you'd expect to see if you had these utility-style regulations.
This year, you're going to hear a lot about what 5G will do. How it could help firefighters see through smoke, connect ambulances with hospitals in real time, give rescuers new tools to locate survivors. But this isn't a commercial about what 5G will do. It's about what 5G will never do. 5G won't replace the courage it takes to run into the fire. It won't make the decision to become an officer any less selfless, or have any impact on what's required to put others' lives before your own. It can't take the place of bravery or substitute for compassion. It will never be the reason people make the choice to serve. 5G is going to change a lot of things, but luckily for all of us, not everything. Share the light.